Okay.
All right, we're live for YouTube now. Okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Julie Martins, and I am the host for today. I am the community manager for Righty Dogs, and it has been a privilege for us as a community to be thriving for over 4 years now, organizing meetups, organizing events like this to educate our community and keep everybody up to speed with current trends and technologies within the space of technical writing. It is with a great privilege that I will be introducing our speaker to us for today's section. And any question you probably might have, you can drop it in the comment section as you're streaming on YouTube. And do well to also share the YouTube link to your friends and to your contacts for other persons to learn. Because today's section is actually packed out and it's going to be very impactful. We'll be talking about internal documentations and public facing documentation, how to craft a better one, the tools to use, how to host them, make it visible for others to experience the documentation, read the documentation, and consume the documentation, how to gather feedback both internally and public facing docs, and a lot of other things we'll be talking about today. And I have with me here today Dominic Brain. He's an experienced technical writer. He has been in the space for over 6 to 7 years. And I think I'll just give him the mic and he's going to tell us a little bit about himself. Then he jump right in. If there are any questions you might have, you can drop it in the comment section and we will attend to it. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. All right, over to you, Brain.
Dule, can you give me the ability to share my screen and I'll put up my slides?
Awesome, I can do that.
Great. Uh, in the meantime, really happy to be here. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Dule for inviting me. This is very cool. I don't think that I think I've honestly only done live streams and sessions like this with England and the US and Canada. So this is really cool for me to have such a diverse audience. Let me take 1 second to share my screen. There we go. Okay, can you see my slides with the black with the white text?
Yes, we can see your slide. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so this is the big presentation, and I'll get into an opening where I'll introduce myself. My name is Brian Dominic. I run a tiny one-person organization called DocOps Lab. I do have a private, like a LLC consultancy that I use to work for clients. Um, but I'm not going to get into that today. I might talk a little bit about what I do for clients, but for the most part, I want to focus on my open source projects, a lot of which revolve around some of the things that we'll be talking about here. I have a website, docopslab.org. I have been a developer for 25 years or so, since 1999. When I first got into building content management systems for like news organizations and community forums and things like that. And then in 2015, I got the opportunity to become a lead technical writer at a big data startup. I think yeah, here we go. And I did that for a few years. And then when that startup got acquired, I went out on my own and decided to become a consultant to just talk to companies and do like 2 to 12 month engagements of building tooling and workflows and stuff like that for their documentation systems. Right now, I'm spending a lot of my time trying to open source a lot of the stuff that I built for these clients. All of my contracts say that I can open source the stuff. And so that's what I'm doing through the DocOps Lab. And I've been a participant and a member of Write the Docs since 2017. I went to my first Write the Docs conference in Portland in 2017, which was amazing and totally sort of re-geared my career in this direction. Um, what I kind of expect about the audience that this talk is for is that you're either a developer who, writes documentation, or you're a technical writer, or you want to be, but at least that you have some concept of that space. And that you, in addition to probably doing lots of user-facing documentation, have already encountered or expect to encounter that there's going to be this divide between the public-facing and the internal documentation at whatever organization you're at. It's inevitable. And so presumably if you're here, you've already kind of went, oh my goodness, or have already started dealing with that kind of issue. For most of this talk, I'm going to kind of assume, just for the sake of convenience, that we're talking about an organization that puts out enterprise software, meaning that it's business to business, or at least business to, a wide range of different types of users. Um, that the subject matter experts on the product side are going to be software developers and product managers. Those are the people that are going to have the information that the technical writer is going to know. And the technical writer might just be a developer. You might not have any specialized technical writers. But I'm going to use the word documentarian, as we tend to in the Write.Docs community, to sort of imply that, obviously most developers are also technical writers to some extent. Um, and this is key here, that the audiences for your documentation, for the public documentation, are going to be not just end users who might be using a web interface or a GUI, a graphical user interface, or a form, or even a command line interface, but they're also going to be downstream developers who are going to use things like APIs and whatnot. Which I'll get into in a bit. I'm going to talk about jargon for just a minute, just to kind of make sure everybody's caught up. Um, these are some of the terms that I'll probably throw around, and I'll try to explain myself as I go, but I kind of expect that you've at least heard of Git, which is the major, really, really dominant version control system in software development. APIs are, for what we'll be talking about, they're the remote interfaces that that cloud products offer, so that you can write code that will interact with their databases and that sort of thing. SDKs, software development kits. I'm going to use these fairly interchangeable. APIs and SDKs, I'll probably say them together a few times during this talk. They're basically ways for downstream developers or internal developers, and this is going to be some of the key confusion that I'm going to spend some time trying to differentiate. A lot of your audience will be internal developers or external developers, downstream users who want to use your APIs and SDKs to build their own products, their third-party products. And Docs code is something that is going to come up a bunch because it's the way I approach documentation. I'm not going to focus exclusively on that. I'm not going to assume that you can use Docs code, which is, using a programmer's tools, interfaces, infrastructure to author and generate documentation and deploy documentation. I'm not going to assume that, but it's a term that I want you to know, and it is a thing that'll get referred to probably a few times here. So I already said a documentarian is kind of someone who contributes substantially to the docs. I'll probably use TW and technical writer interchangeably. That's clearly someone who focuses on docs. PMs, especially for this topic, is going to refer to sometimes project manager and sometimes product manager, and I'm going to differentiate. But these are two contributors to especially internal documentation that are separate roles. And this is one of the funny things about being in tech, is that you could be at a company that's never even heard of a project manager that has PMs and they only mean product manager, or vice versa, or they have both and they're always confused. I'll try to be clear, but a project manager is usually inside the engineering department, inside the engineering team, and they're kind of managing the development of the product. And the product manager is someone who defines the product and says, here's what it should do, here's how we know it's working, here's what our customers are using it for, that kind of thing. And then another key internal role is going to be support. Support technicians often I have to be honest, I almost forgot this role when I was putting this talk together. But truthfully, they may be your best subject matter experts. They may be the people that know the most about the product, or certainly the most about how it's actually getting used in the real world. So let's try to keep them in mind too as internal roles, and they will definitely be reading both your internal and your external documentation. This is a role that needs to know how users find things in the docs externally, but they also have a significant amount of internal documentation that's just for them. Um, Sometimes it's the systems that help them answer questions on the fly and that kind of thing. Um, and then let's talk for just a minute about the external roles. The end user is probably who most of us first think of when we think of consumers of documentation, and they're using mobile apps or web forms or command line interfaces, whatever the end interfaces are for the product, there's an end user who we'll refer to. But then there's a developer user, or a dev user, or a downstream dev, and these might be terms that I'll use. When we're talking about those users who are going to write programming code to interact with your documentation, or sorry, with your product through APIs, SDKs, and so forth. Um, so our external docs they focus on interfaces for the most part, right? That's how users, whether they're developers or they're end users, they look at our product as a series of interfaces. And when we write public-facing external docs, that's most of what we're trying to convey. Um, that consumer is going to be either a prospective client or customer, or a current customer that could be the purchaser that purchased your docs or to purchase your product, and therefore your docs need to look good for them. But mainly, of course, they're the user. They're the person that's going to interact with your uh, public-facing product day to day. Um, and then, of course, let's not forget that the external docs do also mean the developer documentation, at least the subset of it that is made public for those downstream third-party users, the developers. For internal documentation, again, it's also actually mostly interfaces. That's mostly what we're talking about. Sometimes it's more configuration interfaces, and a lot of times it covers assets and infrastructure and the procedures that the team uses to develop and ship code, the code styles, the documentation styles. There's guides for all that kind of stuff. That's usually internal, and most users would never even want to look at it. Sometimes developer users might want to know some of that, but most end users would just glaze over if you started talking to them about your internal styles or any of that kind of stuff. So that stuff that it tends to be exclusively internal. And in this case, and this is important, the consumer of the internal documentation is your coworkers. It's people that you know. It's collaborators on an open source project. Um, Also, crucially, it's people that you haven't met yet because they haven't joined the team yet. And also, crucially, it's future you. You're writing documentation, especially internal documentation, because you're going to need to use it. So if you think about, let's set aside interfaces. If you think about a style guide for documentation, for technical writing, you're going to need to turn to that style guide tomorrow or next week, certainly pretty frequently. And just for clarity, when we talk about internal documentation, it's not private or secret documentation necessarily. You can imagine that if you haven't looked, but there's plenty of them on GitHub or whatever, or GitLab, open source projects have lots of internal documentation. They have contributor guides and they have stuff like that most end users would never want to look at. Even READMEs are often really focused just on people that work on the product one way or another. Um, and they might not be part of the organization, but if they're going to contribute, make open source contributions, then they're going to be that much involved with that kind of documentation. Um, but even most open source organizations probably have some internal documentation that's just private that we don't see on GitHub. But it's not necessarily a private public divide. It's more of an internal and external slash public divide, if that makes sense. Okay, now I'm going to get into what's the big problem here. Like, why don't we just keep a set of documents for for the end users and the downstream users, and a set of documents for the internal people at our organization? What's the big deal? Well, I think that the problem centers around this issue that you're documenting overlapping subjects, and I'm going to use APIs And I'm sorry if people haven't had a lot of experience with APIs, but they really are one of the better examples of this, where often there's huge overlap between the private API it's often the same exact API, frankly, that the internal developers, inside the organization are going to use and that the downstream developers are going to use, usually with a few differences. And yet the problem is that we deliver external documentation and we author external documentation often with really different tools, provide them on very different platforms, and we get this kind of divergence here that we're going to explore here. Content divergence always happens. Any complex project is going to have content divergence. If you have a cloud version and an installable version of your product, already have divergence. There's already going to be some difference there. It might not be much. You might just be used to noting it with little alert boxes that say this only affects, cloud or something like that. But you're already starting to see divergence and you're already starting to feel like, okay, we might need to provide two different things. And that's just for public documentation. It gets even crazier when you think about having to split off actually secret or private or only of interest to internal uh, uh, stakeholders versus the public. Um, and the truth is that source duplication is a problem. If you duplicate where I write down the source of truth and I make two different ones, now I've either got to maintain that by every time that changes, I have to go to both sources and change it, which can sometimes be pretty onerous. Or, and I just added this at the very last minute, as I realized that the other way to deal with source duplication is to get rid of it and try to unify your sources, which is going to be a significant part of what I talk about here. Not always possible. I'm not going to assume that you can do this in some sort of purist way, but I am going to explore some of the ways that that can be accomplished. Um, so what are some of the divergence breakdowns that we're talking about? We have the different roles that are going to contribute to documentation in different ways. We have the different ways people in those roles tend to be used to interacting with content. So technical writers and certainly project managers or product managers are going to be used to using what you see is what you get technology, like they're going to be using Google Docs or Microsoft Word, that sort of thing, where it shows you almost exactly what, the outcome of the document, what the next reader is going to see. Technical writers are used to using XML-based products like DITA that uses component content management systems. These are big, elaborate systems that are actually pretty hard to use, pretty hard to learn. Whereas developers and technical writers who might have started in the software world are going to be more used to seeing lightweight markup like Markdown and ASCII doc and restructured text, and they're going to be more used to working in Git and platforms like GitHub and that sort of thing. And these are big, big divergences. And when people think like, oh, I'm a DITA expert, or I've been using Flare or FrameMaker for 5 or 10 years, and I could never learn Docs as code and lightweight markup. That seems so much harder. Not true at all. I actually think the barriers are very similar. It's a lot of work to get good at this stuff. To become a professional at it, it takes professional type commitment. Um, but because that divide exists, there is significant divergence here when it comes to audiences. We've already talked about the end users, the downstream developers, and then, of course, the internal audiences. But that's a big difference. Who you're writing for makes a difference in what you write and how you write it. And then, of course, the delivery methods. A lot of times, docs get generated, whether it's from Flare or DITA or a lightweight markup system. You're going to generate a static site and just serve that out to the public. Sometimes it's a more dynamic situation. It's more of a wiki style where anyone can at any minute click edit on something and modify the text and then save it. And then everyone who has access to reading that sees that updated content. And then sometimes you have the really long-term stuff like PDFs. In the enterprise world, especially in IT, which is where I come out of, a lot of IT departments require the products that they purchase, that they use, even if they're cloud modern products, they require PDFs for various reasons I won't get into. But you can imagine that these different types of outputs and the ways that you're going to deliver are going to make a big difference in how you document. Um, so getting more into this platform issue, um, these are some of the sort of dualities that I've seen at the organizations that I've consulted with or worked at myself, where developers are keeping all their internal stuff in Confluence, which is Atlassian's sort of wiki-like knowledge base product. It's very good in a lot of ways, but it does help create this divide between the internal and the external. So they might be, delivering all of their product docs over GitHub Pages or something like that. You might see people using Google Docs or Google Spreadsheets, which are really convenient. Cloud-based spreadsheets that multiple people can contribute to are very cool. I often recommend them, but they don't translate very well to a cloud platform like Read the Docs, which is very, and user-oriented. Often the users in that case are developers, but it's very much, a polished deployment display of documentation. Notion is another one of these really cool internal systems that some people use to generate public documentation, but I actually think there's a pretty big divide there versus, in this case, I used the example of Open API and Markdown. It's another one of, these like things that you can deploy really well through a cloud platform. But if you started out in Notion, you're gonna have to do a lot of work to get anything back over to that other platform. And then a really common one, especially for companies that have a lot of money laying around, is that they spend a lot of money on Microsoft cloud products and things like that. And then they use these very, very cool, very powerful, rich text producing XML based products like Flare and Dita. And they tend to cost a lot per seat. But you can see there, some of the problems are that even if you can get the developers to maintain their internal docs in SharePoint, which they're probably not going to love because it's not where they're used to working, they are not likely to ever learn Flare or Dita, and they're very unlikely, and the company's probably unlikely to buy them seats on whatever platform you're doing. They're often like $250 a month and up. You're going to pay that for every developer who ever needs to write some documentation, just so that they can directly write it and contribute it in the system where the technical writers work. Very unlikely. Mostly what you find there is this big divide where the technical writers have to kind of go get that information, drag it over to the Flare or a Dita system, and go from there with the docs. So when it comes to understanding software products and the source of truth for them, the real true source of truth is always the product source code. What we typically see, even in setups where there's no technical writers, where all the developers are doing all the documentation, we tend to see a duplication of that by having a separate documentation source code that doesn't really draw from the product source code at all. And once these diverge, you either have to strictly and manually, through a lot of effort, maintain the documentations reflecting the actual source of truth, or you just lose out. The divergence happens right there because you're already keeping track of things in two different places. Now, this is sometimes necessary. I'm a purist, and I spend most of my life trying to drag companies and teams to working in the most pure ways possible, where you define the product and the documentation using the exact same source. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But sometimes this is just an inevitability. Certainly, when you first join a team, even if you had all the skills and tools that I have and are ready to convert them to a really awesome system, it takes 6 months, and you still have a product to put out. You still have to work this way to some extent. So I'm not here to tell you that it's the wrong way to work. I'm here to try to offer some principles that will maybe help you move toward having a single source of truth. So this is an ideal breakdown of how documentation could look. I'm a little we're a little bit worried about time, so I'm not going to go into super great detail here, but it would be really cool if the truth is that the internal developers have their own system. It might be sourced exactly the same as the external stuff, but it just shows the stuff that they need. And then the downstream developers get a sort of public version of that. And then the end users, of course, for their, public UIs. I don't remember what it says off of that in the, the second thing here, but um, the maybe the configuration references, they will just get the stuff that they're going to use and never be bothered with any of the other stuff. In reality, this is more what documentation source kind of looks like. And I've already had a couple, I've already tried explaining this exactly to a couple of people. The confusion is mostly what I'm trying to convey. Um, this sliver here on the outside of developer docs might be the public APIs, whereas this over here is all of the internal stuff that only the internal developers need to worry about. This circle could be moved all the way to the right, except for a little sliver here, and be, you know, there's, uh, only 10% of the API is kept internal and secret to the in-house internal developers. Doesn't really matter. The truth is that there's two things, and you can see the confusion here. This yellow part in the middle is kind of my focus, that both people might really understand where all three going to come together is the configuration for the product and also the introduction, the overview of what the product does. The internal developers are certainly going to need to know what the heck this product is. The external developers are going to need to know that, and the end users really need to know what is this product. So you'll have a bunch of content that is the same for everybody. In fact, you don't really want your internal developers to think of your product all that differently than the way external developers do. They just have to know some other stuff, or end user users for that matter. So this overlap and confusion, without going into it too much further, we could revisit it later during questions if anyone wants to talk about how this actually plays out. But this is the way we actually find documentation, and that overlap is where we'd want to really unify our sources. But even still, even in the parts that don't overlap, we don't want to have too many systems for authoring and delivering documentation, just because we don't want to have too many systems for doing that. So even if you have a great way to produce end user docs, if it's totally separate from and in addition to the way you're doing internal docs, the way you're doing developer docs, that's overhead that we don't necessarily want. So ideally, we'd try to converge around a few technologies that unify all of this. I know I'm going really fast, but well, I'm hoping to have lots of time at the end, and there's already been some questions offered, and we'll go through whatever comes up. And I'm trying to save some time for that. So there's a couple of examples that I've written down. I'm going to tell you how to get these slides at the end of the talk as well. So again, well, let's focus on the configuration one. We often have configuration files that are defined internally in the product code. That's almost always the way you find the way configuration files, or I should say a configuration form interface. We've all seen these things, you go to settings and then you modify the settings. The product has to source all of that somewhere. They have defaults, they have descriptions, they have the type of data that they'll accept. If it's time in seconds, it's not going to let you type in letters. It's going to require a number, that kind of thing. And that has to be known somewhere, and it has to be conveyed to the user somewhere. And this is where we see tons of divergence. So let's consider a case where there's two API references, and the public API reference gets served in some really beautiful place out on Mintlify or any of these platforms that are totally designed around serving API docs for developers. They spend all their time making that a great experience. And then the private stuff that you're not serving out there very often tends to get stuck in these totally different systems where it's in a different form. It's not searchable across both systems, and the internal developers are struggling back and forth between the public documentation, which again is often exactly the same as what they need for their work internally on the product, or they're building the web interface for their cloud version, and they're giving third parties an API to build their own web interface or their own any other kind of interface, but they're using that same API, but they're struggling between two totally different sets of docs. And an even more compounded example would be when you have 2 to 4 different configuration guides and interfaces where there's a public one for the open source users for the free tier of our product, and we throw that up on something like Read the Docs or just on GitHub. And then the paid users, of course, we give them a really nice web UI, and that has configuration settings in it, and next to each one it has a description and that sort of thing. And it's inline documentation, inline help in that case it would be. And then, of course, you have these private versions of both of these configuration settings, which have either like the real information or commentary on it, or whatever, but it's the actual source of truth of how these end configuration systems work, and that's what the QA testers and the developers have to use. QA is like quality assurance. So anyone who's testing the product, they're using these internal documentations about this. And I say that's too much divergence. That's too many places to have to change the default path for some file that's, output by your product. If the product manager ever says, "Oh, we got to change this," um, that sort of thing. It's so many places that you have to document that change. So key differences between uh, internal and external docs. Internal docs are going to be very, very heavily maintained by subject matter experts like the developers and the product manager and the project managers. Often the only internal docs that you'll find at an organization that technical writers touch are the ones about documentation, right? The style guides and the guides about how to deploy the docs and that sort of thing. Um, that's a weakness. I think not having technical writers or professional writers ever even review your internal documentation is a problem. Um, there's fewer constraints on delivery, but that's only because if they're your employee, you can say, "Oh, here, go do this, go jump through these hoops to find this documentation. We're paying you to do that." You'd never do that to a customer, and if you do, you expect to upset them. And so, therefore, the internal docs are usually kind of less polished, and the internal documentation is always has that kind of fallback where the engineering manager can tell you, "Oh, you know what? Just go look at the code. The truth is in the code. You don't really need a document for that." Um, and whereas external and user-facing documents, even if they're for developer users, these have to be really nice. They have to be accurate. They have to be up to date. You, except for open source projects, and it's not even a good policy then. You can't just say, "Go look at the source code." No, that's not how anybody wants to learn what this product does. They want nice, searchable documentation. They don't want to have to learn the native code language that the product is sourced in, like Java or JavaScript or Ruby or Rust or any of these, Python. They don't want to have to go learn, they don't have to sort through all that just to find out what the user-facing stuff does, of course. Um, and so that difference leads me to think that we have these problems emerge from it. The risks of bad documentation are pretty significant. They're always obvious when it comes to the user-facing stuff. If your audience is the customer or the end user, if bad docs can lose you money. If it's a prospective a user, they can lose the deal for you. But if the product is a coworker, sorry, if the audience is a coworker, now bad documentation leads to frustration. It leads to extra work cycles. This is something that your manager or the engineering manager might care about, but you really care about this. You don't want to be known as the technical writer or the documentarian that wrote the bad docs that wasted half of somebody's day or anything like that. And in open source situations, you might lose entire contributors, people that might have contributed to your open source product. They can't figure out how to, they can't figure out how it works, how to build the development environment. They're going to just go away. They're going to go find something else to do with their time. Okay, so that's the problem set, and it's big. These are all the reasons that we need special strategies to deal with internal documentation. And I'm going to start talking about solutions with some basic principles, and I narrowed it down to four. I'm going to try to stick to these four. I think there's a few others that I might elaborate someday, but I think if you could stick to these principles, you'd end up with pretty good internal documentation. All docs are first-class docs. If the documentation's accuracy isn't important, the document isn't important. If the document is important, it should be accurate and it should basically fall under all of the uh, techniques of documentation that you'd use for user-facing documentation. Um, the way to get good docs is to meet developers or really meet subject matter experts where they're at. And this means that you need to kind of deliver it to a system that's easy for them to get to, but more importantly, that they need to be able to author it in something using a tool that they're already going to be logged into, using a technique that they're already used to. You're not going to drag them over to some whole new system that rarely works. The system has to at least be somewhat or mostly like what they're used to. And for the PMs, for the project managers and product managers, this often does mean dragging them into some tools, or at least making it so that their tools that they use can convert easily to your stuff. There's some effort there, but mostly you're going to go try to lower the bar to contributing to the documentation. Um, Minimizing the number of technologies. I think that's straightforward, but only once you start implementing this will you see where the problems really arise with that. You don't want to add a bunch of logins, a bunch of new technologies that people have to learn. And then the fourth principle is don't repeat yourself. Try to single source documentation. If you can have the same source generate the public documentation that and the internal documentation, that's optimal. Doesn't mean you can never repeat yourself. It's just a principle that you're aiming for. So all documentation is first class docs. I'm going to try to rush through some of this. I think that it's somewhat elementary, but to me, it means you've got someone who understands documentation, not just someone who understands software. Looking over these documents, making sure that it's structured properly, making sure that the style works, that it's clear, that kind of thing. And I just think that they should all be delivered in ways that are similar to the ways that you'd deliver user docs. I've seen this at companies when people find out that their internal documentation is just as good as the user documentation. They love that. They do not want to dig through a bunch of tools, a bunch of archives to find what they need. Um, so meeting developers where they're at, it tends to mean using the platforms that they're already using. This often doesn't mean Docs as code because they're often doing something in Confluence or a wiki, which I wouldn't call Docs as code. They're code-like to some extent in some ways, but they're really cloud platforms that, they might already be using. So if you're going to do internal docs, you may need to go meet them there. If you have a bigger opportunity to start using code-like tools that are similar to the stuff where they write their source code, they'll probably be willing to meet you there. I'm not going to get too into this because I've got a bunch more I want to cover. Um, so same with the way you deploy. I sometimes find myself needing to deploy Docs as code into the Confluence system, say to even just to take advantage of the search that they're already using. If they're going to keep some of their docs in Confluence or Notion or something, I'm going to find a way to use the API to publish get tracked docs as code into the rich text pages of their documentation platform. Another way is a static site that's kept private just by the VPN. I once built an identical version of the product site um, for a company for its internals. It had like 15 extra pages, but this way they had a unified search and they could look through all the documentation in the same place, and it was served on their VPN, so no user would ever stumble across that and see the wrong stuff, whether it mattered or was private or just would confuse them. Keep the tools chain short. We talked about this. I'm not going to get super into what all this is. When it comes to helping technical writers or non-developers work with these systems, the runtime environments and using systems like Docker containers can really, these are modern ways that we kind of jump over a lot of the hassle that we had even 10, 15 years ago, trying to get non-developers to be able to interact with the same kind of source and the same product stuff. Linters, maybe some of you have encountered. The most popular one for technical writers is called Veil. It's a testing system that's going to evaluate your Docs as code content before you ship it out the door. It's going to give you style advice and warn you of problems. Um, Okay, I'm gonna move through some of this kind of quickly. Um, More on the content stack. This is a Docs as code content stack. You're gonna need four components to it. I'm gonna give talks and write articles on some of the stuff that elaborates at great length very soon. Um, that will explore this. But for now, you need a way to mark up your content to turn it that'll turn into rich text. You definitely need some kind of data markup so that you can keep that canonical product data in one place and absorb it into the documentation, but also absorb it into the product. We're going to explore that pretty heavily. A templating system is what you need in order to make that transition, and we'll look at some examples of that. And then you're going to need scripting. It doesn't mean you need to do the scripting, but someone on the team is going to have to write some kind of automation to perform repeat tasks that would otherwise be 12 commands in a row, and this command would change once in a while and that kind of thing. Scripting is how we streamline all of that. Um, so then one of the last principles is that don't repeat yourself, write once, deliver everywhere. The true single sourcing defines the product and the docs. That's what I was just talking about, using some source like YAML to keep the canonical data about the product in one place. Feed the product that data so that the product always reflects that single source of truth from that literally one file, and feed that same data to the documentation system so that the documentation always stays updated. That way, a product manager can go into the YAML file and change something, and then only at review time do the documentarians and the developers have to just look at that and go, okay, yeah, I approve. Product manager says the new default path is this. It doesn't break anything, or they even add something. We approve of that. That's the way you want these systems to work. You don't want what they what's often called at organizations throwing things over the wall, where the developers just have to open an issue ticket, a work ticket for documentarians to actually write down the stuff that the developer just did. Especially for small changes, that's never optimal. Okay. One of the strategies for this is that you conditionalize your source. I'm going to do this more from example in a minute, but it means recognizing different delivery methods like PDF or website, different audiences, more importantly, like that internal versus external user, that sort of thing. And then using conditionals in whatever system that you're using, the writer-oriented ones, or say writer-oriented, but the professional technical writer ones like Flare and Dita, they support this. And then of course, most of the lightweight markup systems will support this one way or another. We'll look at that in a second. Um, so that's the broad solution space. That's the kind of abstract of it. And now I'm going to get into some nitty-gritty examples. And the first thing I'm going to show you is how with the ASCII doc markup system, which is like a much, much richer and more complex version of Markdown, but it's kind of a superset of Markdown. If you know Markdown, you know almost all of the overlap between Markdown and ASCII doc. ASCII doc just offers a lot more. And with Markdown, to do some of this functionality, you'd need a second technology to intersperse with it, but it's all standard as part of ASCII doc, which is why I recommend and prefer ASCII doc, and also why I'm going to use it as examples here. So if def is a way of saying if we've defined a variable called env internal here, which means environment is internal, then we're going to transclude or include show the file that has the private settings in it. And then end if means stop that conditional. And then down here, we don't have any if def statement around it or any kind of if conditional statement around it. And everybody gets the public settings. This is for one document. If we're going to publish, and now you can see the command that we'd use to publish the internal docs, the internal docs are then going to include the internal and the public, right? The external settings that the internal people need to use. Whereas if we were to generate the same document without passing it that env internal variable, then it would only show the public documentation, and we'd have a separate version that we could deploy to the public. So that's a real simple one-step way at looking at one of these things. And now we're going to go into a series of examples that will show what I was talking about with storing the source of truth in YAML and then generating it different ways to get it into different outputs. So let's imagine that our configuration file has a couple of settings that users use, like a base URL and a timeout for the requests. And then there's a server only, internal only, setting called retries, which is how many times someone's allowed to ping the server before we just reject them. And that's a private setting. So as you can see in this YAML, and if you're not familiar with YAML, I think what I've done here is straightforward enough that you can get the gist of it. We've added one property. We've added one sort of parameter to the retries property, which is private. And we're going to say that's a private setting. Users don't even need to see that because they can't enter it in their configuration. It won't make a difference. The next step is to use a template. This is a language called Liquid. Most of them have like these curly brace percentage type markup. And what we're doing here is we're looping through those properties. We're looping through these items in here, and then we're testing them to see if they're public and or if we're making a private document or public document, and then they're going to generate a little bit of output for that in ASCII doc. And so this code is going to turn into this ASCII doc source code once we render the data through the template. And this is pretty close to being user readable. It's not what we want to show a user, but it's definitely something that you could edit or at least read. And then this converts to documentation in rich text, which is, the bold is automatic and the literal style is automatically embedded in there. And that could be for HTML or PDF delivery. So that's the process that I use to make sure that the canonical data that started in this format always stays accurate once it reaches the public facing format. But there's more. The other thing that this can do with a slightly modified liquid template is generate sample uh, configuration files. You see these with a lot of products, and in every case that I've ever seen how it's done internally, someone is literally maintaining a separate static file where every time something from this source changes, they have to go down here and edit the name of the property, the default value of the property, or the description of the property. This is a huge pain, but this template does it all. It just generates that for you. So this is how I build my configuration sample files. Every time I compile my product to ship out, it just automatically updates any changes that I've made to the configuration, and everybody gets a sample file that they could copy and paste into their system and then change the defaults wherever they want to. It's a pretty common method. It's extremely laborious and very, very prone to divergence and inaccuracy. But there's more. I'm now going to, doesn't matter what you're seeing here. This is Python not having those configuration settings hard coded into it. It's dynamically reading from that YAML file and it's getting the configuration system and loading it as an object. Same with Rust. You could do this all from the same YAML product. So if your company generates uses two different runtimes, you no longer have to maintain the source of truth in two totally different languages. You keep it in one place in YAML, you generate it this way. Same with Java, same with Ruby. These are all different ways of doing the exact same thing with that one source of truth. Same with rendering it into your settings panel for your mobile app or your web form interface. And then truthfully, also that same document now becomes a source for testing accuracy. I We're a little bit off of internal documentation here, although I think this is very, very much internal, documentation, less so, versus public. It also could be used to generate public documentation. But the point here is that this is why developers will find an advantage in this approach and not be as hard to sell as if you just said, "Hey, I need you to keep things in YAML so I can keep my documentation straight." No, keep it in YAML so that your product can also stay up to date without all the extra work that's done with hard coding these things in the software. So those are some examples of the internal, external, the single sourcing for internal and external documentation. Now, quickly, I'm going to try to go through a case study of another kind of internal-external divide. Um, Work on software is almost always done in a ticketing or an issue tracking system like Jira, like GitHub issues, where each change to the product has a corresponding work ticket that needs to be processed, and that work ticket system is the source of truth for in release notes and change log information, but it's usually manually converted over. Whereas the solution for this, I think, is to add a little field in the Jira system or add a notation in the GitHub issues, and then use a script that will download from the API, from the cloud API, where all 10, 50, 100 developers are keeping their stuff, and then generate a markdown file that's easy to work with, and then you can just save that file in Git and let it publish through whatever automation process you have. So here's a command. This is literally a script that I've written for a client where they already were using Python. So I wrote in Python a script that would ping their API. It would say, get us the the version 2.3.0 changes, the issues and the release notes for the Acme Cloud product. And then what does that do? It goes through a templating system. This is Jinja 2. I showed you Liquid before. I realized that they're almost identical syntax for this purpose. Again, we're going to use a for loop that loops through, and if the issue has release notes, it's going to print it out. Otherwise, it's just going to print out the summary and the issue key. And this is the kind of thing that that's going to produce. So now you've got a markdown document, and this is what you'd see. This is all you'd see as the technical writer who might be the last person touching all this stuff. So now you might be doing things like developers tend to write in the present tense or the imperative tense, and you'd be writing things like, "Oh, we fixed the login issue. We improved the performance. We added a new API endpoint," and then you might, change a little bit of text here, like. Introduces, did I spell that right? Introduces a new API endpoint. That's the work that you'd be doing instead of what I've had to do before, which is if you're going to automate this, you could go in and change it inside every issue ticket using the cloud platform, which is a huge pain. You could tell the developer to do that. But there's not really, this is a smooth way to break through that divide and use this kind of technology to actually uh, save just tremendous amounts of effort and problems in my experience. So here's a little bit of overview of what I think that would have improved that system. Okay, give me 1 second. I haven't left a lot of time. I'm going to quickly go through. These are some topics that we didn't talk about. You need a unified search for all of the internal documentation. I didn't talk about documentation audits where you go through and you find out where the divide is. There's a whole systems for that. I'd love to talk another time about that. It would be a whole other talk. Um, Product versioning alignment is a big deal. If you have multiple versions, sometimes the internal docs also need to align with those versions. And then document lifecycle management becomes very important for internal documentation. Often external docs are just aligned with the product versions. If a version gets deprecated or is no longer supported, you can just take those docs offline, and that's the lifecycle. With internal, they often live on whole different life cycles, and it's a completely different question. Um, this is for, some of the topics that we talked about that I think would be advantageous to explore if you want to really figure out how to get kind of superpowers for addressing some of the problems that we've talked about. Uh, the slides are up at docopslab.org/slides/internal. Same exact slides that I just showed you. They'll be there indefinitely. And then the place that you can find me is in Write the Docs. If you're not already in the Slack community there, it's an awesome community, and I'm at Brian D. And if you come in there, everybody in there knows that you can ask me anything, and I'll at great length try to help you out. I don't charge for that kind of thing or anything. I do big long consultations with lots and lots of members of the community. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of your own problem, and you can't do it in the only 10 minutes that I'm afraid I've left for questions, then do it there. Find me there, and then just go find these in the slides if you want to see a couple other talks that I dug up that are on internal docs that might, they're at different speeds and focus on different things. Okay. Dule, do you want to do you want to orchestrate questions for me while I take a quick breather?
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was lovely. Okay, at least I have like two questions on the YouTube channel, on the chat in YouTube, two questions from two users. The first
Great.
question there from Tech Talk, I don't know if it's a he or a she, but the person is asking, at what point does a technical writer uses the ASCII docs conditioner and transposition? Do you want to take the
Okay.
question one after the
Yeah.
other, or I should just give you all out?
If you're working in a DOCSIS code system, then your divergence, meaning where the documentation that you need to produce, where it differs, is going to depend on the circumstances. But in the case of internal versus external, we're going to use those conditionals, whether it's ASCII doc or Markdown or any other, or Flare or DITA. we're going to use conditionals to in the source code to say when this source code gets turned into rich text, gets turned into PDF or HTML, or in my case, a slide deck. This slide deck is sourced in ASCII doc. In whatever you're producing, at the time that we convert it to that, the converter is going to look through here and go, oh, is this for an external or an internal audience? And then it's going to make that choice there. So just to be really brief, that's the answer there. But I'm happy to explore this more if you want to catch up with me in Write the Doc Slack or anywhere.
Okay, thank you very much for a quick answer. That was exactly, I think he got that. The video is actually recorded, so if that's not clear, he might definitely, or she, whoever the person
Yeah.
is, might come back to check, and there are possible answers for that. We'll find time to create that more resource to answer such question. Okay, the next question here is from GB. He's asking, how do you validate your source of truth?
That's a great question. Um, you you validate. I mean, it's hard to explain. I think I know exactly what they're getting at, but the source of truth is actually the intention of the source of truth is going to come from someone like a product manager or a developer. They're going to write it down somewhere, hopefully as central as possible. Sometimes the source of truth is in a specification document, which is a natural language document that says the software should do this, the software must do that, the software must not do this, and these are the defaults, and we'd expect things to be here and here and here. And that'll all be in natural language, usually in English, right? So that the developers could look at that and refer to it. If you're gonna define your product or specify your product in something like YAML, now that is a self-validating source of truth. As long as whoever wrote the original thing, like where we went, where were we? Where our timeout was 30, as long as 30 was what they meant. Now the validation happens everywhere we need it to, because once the product is compiled or not compiled, in the process of compiling the product, in the process of turning it into something that actually does what it's supposed to do, we run unit tests and integration tests to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do. And in that case, now, like I showed way down here at the end of this is unit test code that could read from that original file and then say, hey, does it actually do what the YAML definition file said it must do? So the validation of intention comes from some human who said, I want the default to be 30. The validation of outcome of that it actually does this thing usually comes from automated testing at best, or it comes from user quality assurance testing, because automated testing doesn't catch everything, and you should always have humans testing the code. And so they should know how to refer to the YAML document to make sure that, oh yeah, after all, when I install this software, the default value is 30, and when I change it to 45, it changes to 45, that kind of thing. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that helps a little bit for the default, because
Great.
the key take home rather for personally for me is the unit testing and also the manual testing, because
Yes.
there will always be an originator of every document, and that originator of document probably might have worked with a lot of subject matter experts to craft out the documentation.
Right.
And moving forward on the documentation as a source of truth, you just need to validate it and to make sure that it aligns with the product versioning, with the current product status, and also check in with other developers to see if it is actually accurate. So I think that's
Absolutely.
actually correct. Thank you very much for that answer. So the next question I will be taking, I think I will rule out the first one, the one on the documents, the question that was already generated from the community on Discord. I'll rule out the first one because we already talked about that. The first question was how to create or update an internal or public facing docs. I think you've talked about that. I don't know if you might want to talk about it again, but you've actually dealt on that prior to now.
Well, the short answer is look at what systems are already in place. The worst answer usually is some additional system, right? If the developers are working in something like Confluence or Notion or on GitHub, start there, see what you can do from that. You may come to a new organization as a technical writer with a couple years experience, and you just spend a bunch of time with a piece of software that you really love, and you want everybody here to start using that because you know, and you're right, you can make that documentation look great. You will spend a lot less time on the overhead because for you, that's the software that you're most useful. That's where you're going to produce the best stuff. No question. Unfortunately, the drag, the hassle comes in when now you have to bring up, 10, 20, 50, however many developers or other subject matter experts over to your system. And that's why the thing that you're best at, even though you're totally right that you can make that work, I'm not going to be able to give you an answer here because while I have some opinions on both types, on like the cloud-based, user-friendly systems, as they're seen, and the code-based, DOCSIS code systems. I have strong preferences there, but they're never going to override what you actually find at an organization. And so, unfortunately, the answer there is what will work. I just recently compared this to it's the principle around dieting, around food, or any other health practice that you're trying to get into. None of them works for everybody. None of them is the best for everybody. The one that you're gonna stick to, right? The exercise regimen that you're actually gonna do, that's the best one for you. And so now you have to take into account a whole team. The one that the team is actually going to use, unfortunately, I have to sneak out of this question by saying that's probably the one that you should give the most focus to. If it doesn't do the trick, then you have to have that hard conversation around, hey, this doesn't do this, or this that I'm going to want to do with our documentation. Um, and therefore, I want to start, maybe I push another tool in, but only if the thing that's already in place is inadequate. Otherwise, you're probably going to find yourself using what's there.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brian. That was lovely. That was
Yeah,
lovely.
great.
Just to add to that, I'll say it's very, very necessary and always very important for you to have the hard question, to have the hard talk. The hard talk is what aligns your work. So thank you. Okay, talking about while you were answering the question, you made mention of an SME. I think the next question on my bullet points here is we know who is an SME, but while creating internal documentation, for developers working on our products, who is the SME for that purpose? Is it the product manager or the head of engineering or the developers entirely?
Yeah, another great question. And those are the three main possible answers, and I'd throw in project managers sometimes too. It really matters what the subject of the documentation is. If you're documenting specifics of the product, that usually comes from the product manager. If you're documenting the style of the code, that's usually going to be a senior engineer who's going to say, oh, when we write Java code, we use this style, we use this framework, we capitalize these things, and we don't that kind of stuff. You don't want either the product manager doesn't want anything to do with that, and neither does the engineering manager. And neither does the project manager. That's going to be senior developers defining that. When it comes to the workflow stuff, now you're going to see project managers writing those documents, usually in collaboration with the developers. And then, engineering department policies. These are internal documents that I do think often have a technical aspect and should be overseen or reviewed by technical writers, but they're going to come from managers, from engineering managers and that kind of thing. So the question is, it really depends on the subject, and it matters a lot. It matters more than we realize. If the wrong person is tasked with this, they often don't speak up. They just try to do their best when they weren't the right person in the first place. And a technical writer is often the person, or someone who's most oriented toward documentation is often the best person to say, hey, that's been assigned to the wrong person. Let me find somebody who's better to answer these questions and draft this document.
Okay, so the user just typed and is like, "Thank you for your answer."
Great.
Okay, so the next question is, how much should you review publicly when writing a public-facing documentation? I think that question is actually self-answered, but let me hear your opinion.
What I didn't hear what that last little bit you said was, how much should we
Okay,
review
okay.
publicly?
Yeah, the question was when creating a public-facing document about the specific products, for example, um, a SaaS product that users use that don't require technical consumption from the users. How much of an information are you expected to review to the audience, and how do you conceptualize those information you are actually giving out?
If what's meant by review is a document review before it's released,
No,
um,
like publication, like your like publication in terms of review, like when you're trying to publish your documents to the public, right?
yeah.
Making it accessible for people to access your document. Within the content of your document, how much of an information are you expected as a technical writer to review out there, like to make it accessible, to make it open for people to see?
Okay. As a technical writer, your responsibility is to review for clarity, and you rely on the subject matter experts for the accuracy part. And that doesn't mean you don't have to know anything about the product. You usually do have to know quite a bit about the product. But I think in this case, if I'm understanding this correctly, the stress of the review for the technical writer, including if the whole thing was drafted by a developer and you're just the last person to approve it before it goes out, or even if you're reviewing stuff that's already been published, which technical writers find themselves doing all too often, and sounds like it's still in line with what we're talking about. You're doing a clarity review. You're doing a can a beginner understand this type of review, or at least audience appropriate type thing. So a lot. I think that organizations don't appreciate or rely enough on a professional technical writer to look at everything. And I do think that while I would never say if you're the lone technical writer at a big organization, you're responsible, you have to check everything. I'd put that back on the organization and say you need more technical writers, or at least more documentation oriented developers, or somebody who can look at all of this. Nothing should go out the door unreviewed by a professional writer. But that's my bias. My bias is mostly for accurate and clear documentation, but I have a little bit of a bias for hiring more technical writers. They're usually the people that hire me in the end. So I'm always an advocate for having more writers, more eyeballs, and that doesn't mean everybody working 80-hour weeks. It means dividing that task up among hopefully more technical writers.
Awesome.
Hope that
Thank
was
you very
helpful.
much. That was perfect. All right, moving forward, the next question is about information architecture. Now, the user is asking, in terms of internal documentation, how do you implement your IA, your information architecture, or how do you actually structure your content for internal documentation? How do you structure? Do you structure them based on priorities, or you structure them based on alphabetical orders,
Right.
or how do you actually do that? Or what would be
I
your
would
best opinion on
say
that?
I would say this is going to be another one I'm going to kind of sneak out of. Focus on the external documentation structure. And I'm actually not even an expert in this. I wouldn't put myself forward as I do it a lot, but there's people that have written whole books about this. Like, one of the famous ones is Every Page is Page One. And there's a bunch of information architecture stuff that you can study. But without giving a specific answer to that, the truth is that your internal documentation should follow that structure for two big reasons. Um, Developers and other SMEs and internal people at your organization should not have to learn two different things. And more importantly, contributors, technical writers, and developers who are constantly in the docs should also not have to learn two different architectures. So you're often going to have a menu. And this is why I say, ideally, what I do is I generate a copy of the public documentation with a bunch of extra categories, in that menu, basically, for the internal documentation, because that way you've got this real clear divide between the two, but there's no divide in the structure. There's no confusion going back and forth. And when it comes time to create a new document, this is often the time where we struggle. What type of document is this? What category does it go in? That kinds of stuff. it's never going to be made easy, but it certainly shouldn't be so difficult that you have to decide not only is it internal or external, which you'll have to decide, right? Are parts of it internal or external? That those sort of decisions. But you don't want it to be like, well, since it's internal, it goes in this other place, or the external version goes in this menu item and the internal version goes in this other totally different thing. I would say try to make those align as much as possible. Even if you're stuck using two totally different systems, don't make the information architecture diverge. Even if the users are never going to know what the end users are never going to know what the internal architecture looks like, save them from that. Save yourself from that, I guess I should say. Don't divide those up too much. Keep them as closely mapped as possible.
I like the part where you said you should save yourself from that and save the users as well from that. You are now
But
a
that's really
savior.
it, right? Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's it. Yeah, that's the truth. You're actually in the business of saving people.
yeah, yeah. You're
Okay.
if you always consider your own headache down the road, you won't go too far wrong making decisions, you know?
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, now the next set of questions is actually focused on early stage startups. Like there are some questions around early stage startups, like how early should a startup invest in documentation as part of its products development cycle, both internally and public facing? How early do you suggest a startup should
Right.
invest in documentation?
Okay, I have a few answers. I, I've done a lot of work on startups. I've been founder number one of startups, and I've been employee 23, the startup that I did in 2015, where I was a technical writer. I was the first technical writer, and I was employee number 23 there. And I thought that was awesome. That's pretty rare. You usually hire the first technical writer probably after 50 or 60 or 100. I don't even know where, but I've heard all kinds of numbers. 23 is pretty good. The CTO there was very, very documentation oriented, and he pushed for that, as did several of the developers. But the real answer is the CTO is the first documentarian. The first developer is going to have to be contributing to that. And there's no too early, there's only too late. You are going to start with a README file or something on day one, and you're going to build out from there. And I think what this question is getting at is that you're going to do it a certain way that the CTO or whoever was the first to start the docs is going to prefer. And then you're going to hire someone to come in and be a professional documentarian. And at some point, they're going to have to bridge the gap between the mess that the CTO made. And I'm not actually claiming that about the CTO that hired me. His docs were amazing when I came, but I have since also been the first documentarian to look at the docs for several startups, and they're rarely that good. They're often pretty good for the developers to use, but they're not ready for users to look at. And so the internal docs are in some shape, and the external docs are usually in almost no shape and need a lot of work. So the earlier the better, obviously, is the principle. You're not going to convince a CEO or anyone in the HR department that the fourth person hired should be a documentation expert, unless your product is documentation oriented, then maybe very much so. But if your product is some cloud thing that does something that has nothing to do with docs, then it's going to be 20, 30, 40th employee is going to actually be someone who focuses on the docs. But then what's really important is what happens then. That person needs to be empowered to make real changes, to do real stuff with the documentation, including radical things. And so I'd say almost as important as how early you do it is how much power and leeway you give the documentation specialist to come in and actually change things over, because that person is thinking, okay, the next 50, the next 1,000 employees are going to have to deal with this internal documentation, and the next million customers are going to have to deal with this external documentation, and give that person the power to do it right as early as possible. I don't think there's a too early, though. I don't think any good documentarian is going to come in and go, I don't understand what we're doing here. I can't imagine how to do this right. You hired me too early. They're going to have good ideas that are going to be future proof pretty fast.
Awesome, that's great. We are still within the startups. We are still within the startup space. So our next question is
Great.
still based
Love
on
it.
startups. So the next question, I think we have like 9 minutes to wrap this up. So the next question
Okay.
is what impacts does good documentation have on user onboarding, and support load in early stage startup. User onboarding, they didn't actually define the type of users here, whether it's a developer or
Right, right.
yeah, so but just for generic purpose, right? Onboarding a user, even onboarding an employee, how good
Yeah.
documentation
I
does
think
that?
since we're talking about internal documentation, and anybody is as good at answering the second part for users, good docs are good docs. For the internal part, though, boy, I just read a statistic that now I've forgotten the statistic, but some huge percentage of people who leave a job do it in the first 45 days and a big part of that is because of the static of onboarding. So onboarding is really critical, and it's one of the things that you don't get to see during the interview process, even the negotiation phase of the last bit when you're about to join an organization. If you're a software developer, say, and you're about to join, you don't really get a peek at the internal documentation very often. You don't get to see the onboarding process. And when you come in, you don't want to be shocked by how bad it is. Um, and I've had both experiences. I've been the person in charge of documentation when other people had both experiences, especially when I first get there. I joined a startup, and I work on their documentation, including the internal stuff. And someone comes in 5 days later and they don't know that I've only been there for 5 days. And they look at those docs and then they look at me and they're like, what's going on here? Why is this so difficult? Why haven't you solved this? I don't like that feeling. So I think that the answer is very important. I think it can make I think because it sets the tone for that employee's experience, I think it can make all the difference in the world. And I think I've seen it make all the difference in the world. And other parts of the onboarding process can also do that, right? Like if whoever orients them, if whoever their first manager is, if that person's terrible, that can be a terrible experience. If that person's great, that can be a great experience, even despite bad documentation. But what we're really talking about here is how to get up and running with the development environment for the product. That stuff is critical. If you go and look at really good big GitHub projects, they have lengthy guides on how to do this. You should have a lengthy guide on how to do that takes into account the different environments. If a startup says you can come here and we'll let you use Macintosh, we'll let you use Windows, or we'll let you use Linux on your laptop while you code. You have three different answers for how do I get set up, and the docs better include all those three. So that's how important it can be.
All right, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I think we have few more questions to go. Okay, you've actually talked about the next question is actually on do you think product managers should be responsible for internal and public facing documentation? Yeah, you talked about that, but do you have another opinion to share? But I know you actually talked about that because I heard you say something about the three set of persons that are very vital in documentation, and each documentation is dependable on the subject. If the subject is relatively to the product manager, then he will be in charge and will be responsible for that. If the subject is relatable to the head of engineering, then he will be responsible for that to make sure the informations are accurate. But
Right.
I don't know if you have anything else to say, but that was what you
Yeah, just
said
really
earlier.
quickly, I will say as a general principle, and this is probably more for external documentation, the earlier the product manager is aware that it's part of their responsibility, that good documentation is part, and I've talked to product managers that didn't even consider it part of their responsibility, and that's just no way. No. You have to, even if you're the technical writer and they're technically in some way your boss or superior on the hierarchy, you have to drill it into a product manager that part of the product is documentation, that it reflects on it, and that it's always going to come back to them. And whether they think that or not, the truth is that inside the organization and to anybody who knows how software is made outside the organization, anybody outside that knows what's going on inside, they're going to blame the product manager. It's always going to go back to that person. That person is in charge of the docs to some extent. So you should be working with them and they should know that it's a first class part of the product. And just like I say, internal docs are first class documents. All product documentation is a first class component of every software product, in my mind.
Thank you. All right. How do you handle the visibility and accessibility for to the documentation you create? Internal documentation, how is it being accessible by internal team? I think that's self-answered as well because most of them are prepared. But let me hear your opinion because I feel most of the trial documentations, some persons prepare them using Google Docs. But
Yeah.
let's just get your opinion.
I mean, the any system can make decent documentation. If you are starting with a system that isn't made for software documentation, that's when you're going to really have problems. So as long as we're talking about software documentation, including developer documentation, that's when some of those really common tools that anybody can pick up and use, like Google Docs, they really have these weaknesses where they don't really do a great job of displaying source code. They don't really do a good job of giving you the types of special elements that really good technical documentation should have, like admonitions, like notices, information, tip, warning, that kind of thing. And so those are the limitations you get. But I'm going to go back to that answer that I gave, which is whatever tool works. I've seen great docs come out of great and technical documentation come out of Google Docs, for instance. It just takes a little bit more work. It's not going to be perfect, but if that's what you have to work with, you can do good stuff with that. The thing I don't want anyone to take away is that like you can't do great docs with commercial tools or this kind of tool or that kind of thing.
Okay, awesome. Okay, the last question. We have two more questions actually. One is how do you manage user feedbacks? I think there are external tools for that. Okay, now the next thing is what are the tools you would suggest for someone to use? There's name three tools to be used, tools and platforms to be used for creating and publishing both internal and facing documentation. What are the three tools you would suggest? I think that's the last question.
I would go back to where did I have it? Um, no, now I thought I had a list in here. Oh, here we go. If it were up to me and everybody had the ability to implement and learn these things, this is kind of the ideal technical stack that I would recommend trying to build your documentation around. You're going to have to do some custom work. You're going to have to implement it, excuse me, on a case specific basis. You might have to make some changes to this, but if you have developers that are really into getting documentation right, then the answer is the same for both. Do your internal docs and your external docs using code-like systems, using lightweight markup, and converting it into the formats that you need that way. Um, when it comes to other stuff, I'd have to say, come find me in Write the Docs Slack. Ask me specifically, give me give me what your situation is. I have a pretty good overview of the whole tool space in technical documentation. So I love giving this answer. It's if you ever hired me, this is what I'd be building for you because it's what I think makes the absolute best system, um, without question, with some caveats like the templating markup doesn't really matter that much. They're all really similar. But for between ASCII doc and YAML, and again with the scripting, you can do anything with any scripting language. It more has to do with what you have in house. And I put an asterisk on Bash. Oh yeah, right. Sorry, I should have mentioned the asterisks here are, they're my recommended, they're my preference. Um, Bash just because it's already built into every Unix-like system that you'd have on your system. And if you are working in Windows, then you could use Windows subsystem for Linux and have Bash at your fingertips. So Bash scripting is the sort of universal answer. But these first two, I think, are undeniably superior in ways that I could go on and on and on about, and people that write the docs know that I do. I don't think anything compares to YAML and ASCII doc for maintaining your source code, your documentation source code in. But I'm happy to answer for people that can't do code-like environments. There's lots of cloud-based tools and
Yeah,
stuff, and I'm
yeah,
happy.
yeah. I think
Just come find
let's talk
me.
about that. Just give us some brief about those that can do code like environments.
Okay. Um, boy, most of them cost a lot of money. So, but that's not to say that these things are free. Technologies that you're looking at here aren't free. They cost a lot up front because you need developers to implement them and that kind of thing. But I think Stoplight is a great system. I think that for the developer doc systems, um, people like Mintlify, which I had mentioned earlier, I think. Um, so these are some of those cloud-based systems. And Fern is one that someone who I respect has been talking a lot about and getting really good reviews. So it's called Fern, Fern. So those are mostly oriented for developer docs, but they all have platforms for any kind of documentation, and they're mostly Markdown based. So I don't think any of these work with ASCII doc, but they often give you an editor, like a rich text editor and that kind of stuff. Um, and so I guess that's the stuff that I'd recommend because they also have potential for future integration with Git and that kind of thing. So you're not locking yourself out of eventually doing a more of a code-like environment if you're doing that kind of stuff. And they often have free or low-cost seats for the developers to come use it. And the reason I don't recommend for the kind of products that we're talking about using Flare, Madcap Flare, it's a great product in a lot of ways, like an amazing product. Dita is an amazing system, but the platforms that implement these cost a lot per seat. And so, like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to spend a lot of money just to have an engineer have a seat at that they're only going to use once a month or once every couple months. So I think that's why I try to stick to these newer cloud-based platforms that that usually work with Markdown and usually work with Git, but don't require those things.
Awesome. So thank you very much. This is where we'll come to an end for today. It has been a ride. It has been an awesome ride. Thank you, Brain. This was
It was
actually
my pleasure.
awesome. Yeah. We
I hope
thank
to
you.
meet a bunch of people who watch this talk live or who watch it later. Come find me.
Yeah. I think I did a screenshot. If you could, I'll send the screenshot later. I did a screenshot of some sort of persons on the chat on YouTube because trying to see how I can control bombers from attacking the meeting. So thank you very much for doing this.
Gotcha.
And this is where we'll come to an end for today. Watch this space next time. We'll be coming up with some other topics. I think this conversation have given an opening to us looking at to ASIC docs. We need to know what ASCII dog is and understand. We'll do a workshop. Someone will walk us through. I think that's the next session we'll be having 3 weeks from now. So thank you very much.